everyone, and welcome to our first session of the Optimizing Cash webinar series. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Alisha Rabel, and I am the proud founder and CEO of AT&C Revenue Services. I am so excited to be here today just to share with you some of my knowledge over the last 30 plus years in this industry. The inspiration for this webinar series came after the ASCA conference a couple months ago. Following my presentation and meeting so many people at our booth, I had the privilege of meeting with a number of people, ASC leaders, right? And we talked about their centers and their challenges and their opportunities that they were seeing. And what struck me most was how often a simple conversation just led to new ideas and greater clarity, actionable next steps. And those discussions reminded me why I love this industry and why I enjoy sharing what we've learned over the years. And if we can help even just one leader see their revenue cycle a little differently, then we've made a meaningful impact. And that's why I wanted to continue those conversations through 3 webinars over the next few weeks. So again, over the next few weeks, what we're going to do is talk about something that affects every ASC, regardless of your size, your specialty mix, or even your location. And that's revenue cycle. Okay, now when people hear revenue cycle, they often think about billing and collections and claims, but I want to challenge that mindset. Revenue cycle is really about creating predictable cash flows so that your physicians can continue caring for your patients, your staff, they have the resources that they need, and your surgery center can continue to grow. Today's session is all about visibility, okay? Because in my experience, most revenue cycle problems don't start with collections and when those collections decline. They start long before that. And if we don't see them early, we can't fix them. So before we talk about improving revenue cycle performance, I think it's important that we acknowledge the environment we're all operating in today. Because if you've ever felt like revenue cycle has become more difficult over the last few years, you're not imagining that, okay? When we talk about revenue cycle today, I think we can all agree that it's become incredibly complex. It's not just about getting claims out the door anymore. We're dealing with payer changes and rising denials and staffing challenges, right? Pressure to improve cash flow, all while still protecting the patient experience and maintaining compliance. And what makes it difficult is that many centers are trying to make important decisions without fully seeing what's happening underneath the surface of the revenue cycle. And honestly, that's where most problems begin. Because revenue cycle issues usually don't happen because of one major failure. They happen because of small breakdowns that build over time. An eligibility issue, right? Maybe an authorization gets missed, or maybe a denial isn't categorized correctly. A payment gets posted inaccurately, right? Or reporting looks fine at a high level, but doesn't tell the real operational story. Individually, those things may seem small, but collectively, they impact cash flow, create rework, increase write-offs, and lead to burnout and frustration. Okay, and that's what I've seen across this industry is that most teams are working incredibly hard. The real challenge isn't effort, it's visibility, it's consistency, it's alignment. And knowing where the gaps are before they become bigger financial problems, right? That's where we want to be, because improving revenue cycle today isn't just about working harder. It's about understanding what's really happening operationally and knowing where to focus. Now, all of these challenges create pressure on our organizations, but here's what's interesting. Revenue cycle problems usually don't happen because, again, of one catastrophic event. They happen because of the dozens of small issues that quietly build over time. All right, so let me show you what I mean. One of my favorite ways to explain revenue cycle is this. Revenue doesn't disappear all at once. It leaks. Maybe an authorization wasn't obtained. A payer quietly starts changing their policies on implants, right? A high dollar account wasn't worked for 30 days. Maybe documentation sat waiting for a signature. A denial was appealed 3 different times without anyone asking why it was denied in the first place. Individually, these don't seem significant, but collectively, they're the difference between an average month and a great month. So if revenue leak happens slowly, why don't we catch them sooner? In my experience, it almost always comes back to one thing. It comes back to one thing. We simply don't have enough visibility into what's really happening inside the revenue cycle. If I had to narrow down the biggest issue I see across revenue cycle operations today, it would be lack of visibility, because you simply can't fix what you can't see. A lot of centers are tracking metrics, right? But they don't always fully understand what the metrics are actually telling them operationally. Our teams are working in silos with very little transparency across departments. And by the time leadership realizes there's a problem, they're usually looking at a lagging indicator: aging AR, cash slowdown, increased write-offs, right? Instead of identifying issues early enough to proactively manage them. That's where visibility becomes so important, because visibility tells you where accounts are stalling, where denial trends are growing, how your team is truly performing, and whether those workflows are actually producing results. Because activity alone doesn't always equal performance. And without that strong visibility, inefficiencies quietly begin to compound over time, right? Refunds, begin to grow. Credit balances begin to grow. Denials begin to repeat. Opportunities get missed. And that's why I always say that visibility creates control, and control creates accountability. And then the more clearly that you begin to see your operations, the faster and more confidently you can begin to improve it. All right. So once we understand that visibility is the problem, the next question then becomes, what should we actually be looking at? Because there are hundreds of reports available, but in my opinion, there are really only 5 metrics that tell the majority of this story. Now, as we look at this slide of the metrics that matter most, ask yourself, how often do I look at the AR over 90 days? Many of you will probably say daily, and you have a handle on it, right? But do you have true visibility into why those accounts are still sitting there? The actual root cause, that's the difference. Okay, so these metrics are not just numbers on a report, they're signals. Your denial rate tells a story. Days to payment tells a story. Net collection percentage tells a story. And if you know how to read those stories, they'll tell you exactly where your cash is getting stuck operationally. One thing I always encourage leaders to ask is, what is this metric trying to tell us? Because the goal isn't just reporting, the goal is using that data to drive action. Now, I don't want you to leave today trying to memorize benchmarks. That's actually not the point. The benchmark simply tells us when it's time to start asking better questions. Let's look at what each of these metrics is actually trying to tell us. All right, so we've talked about why visibility matters, right? Let's look at what I consider those 5 important metrics in a little bit greater detail. Notice that I didn't really say, ASC billers or collectors, right? These metrics need to mean something to ASC leaders. These are the metrics you should understand. All right. Because these metrics aren't just operational numbers. Again, they're signals. Think of them like a dashboard in your car. All right. When the check engine light comes on, you don't just put a piece of tape over it and keep driving. You ask yourself, what is my car trying to tell me? Revenue cycle metrics work exactly the same way. Every one of these numbers is telling a story. Our job as leaders is to understand that story before it affects cash flow. All right. So let's break this down. AR days, AR over 90 days. Let's start with that one. A healthy benchmark is generally less than 15% of your total accounts receivable. Now, if yours is higher than that, don't immediately assume that your collectors aren't doing their jobs. Instead, start asking better questions. Which payer is driving the aging? Are these high dollar accounts driving your aging? Are appeals sitting unresolved? Is documentation delaying payment? AR over 90 days isn't just an aging metric. It's one of the earliest indicators that cash is becoming difficult to recover. So next is denial rate. We generally want to see initial denials below 5%. One of the biggest mistakes organizations make is celebrating when denials are worked. I don't want to celebrate working denials. I want to prevent them, right? Denials are telling us that something upstream broke. Maybe it was eligibility, maybe authorization, maybe coding, maybe documentation or something of that sort. Every denial has a root cause. If we're only fixing the claim and never fixing the process, we'll continue doing the same work over and over and over again. And that leads to your cash not being optimized. Days to payment. Days to payment is another metric that we watch very closely. A healthy benchmark is generally between 30 and 45 days. This tells us how efficiently cash is moving through the system. If payments begin slowing down, don't assume it's always the payer. Sometimes claims weren't submitted promptly. Sometimes follow-up wasn't timely. Sometimes documentation was delayed, right? So this metric helps us separate payer issues from internal workflow issues. Net collection percentage. This is one of my favorite metrics because it answers one very simple question. Are we collecting the money we've actually earned? A healthy benchmark is typically between 95 and 99%. If this number begins dropping, revenue is leaking somewhere. Okay, it may be underpayments. It may be avoidable write-offs. It may be unresolved denials or simply inconsistent follow-up, right? Whatever the cause, this metric tells us that we're leaving money on the table. The cost to collect. Think of cost to collect as your operational efficiency score. If you're collecting the same amount of revenue, but it's taking more people, more follow-up, and more rework to get there, your cost to collect goes up. Strong revenue cycle organizations don't just collect more, they build processes that make collecting easier. Like every other metric we've discussed today so far, cost to collect is telling a story. It's not just measuring dollars, it's revealing how efficiently your revenue cycle is operating kind of behind the scenes, right? That's the story that it's telling. Now, once you understand the story behind those numbers, the next step is the most important one, because insight without action doesn't improve performance. The highest performing centers or RCM companies don't just review metrics. Okay, they use them to make decisions. So ask yourself, am I just reviewing metrics? Or am I actually using them to drive decisions? Because metrics should create action. If denial rates increase, what happens next? If AR aging grows, who owns it? If days to payment slow down, are we identifying that root cause or just reporting that number month after month? Now, one of the biggest gaps that I see is centers reviewing the same reports over and over without clear ownership or follow through attached to them. The strongest revenue cycle teams don't just track trends. Okay, that's the easy part. They respond to trends. Because if a metric doesn't lead to visibility, accountability, or action, it's really just noise. So let's make this practical. Maybe you're sitting there thinking, this all makes sense, right? But what should I actually do when I get back to my desk and get back to business? I want to leave you with a simple roadmap that you can begin implementing immediately. Okay. One of the biggest mistakes that I see organizations make is trying to fix everything at once. Revenue cycle is simply too complex for that, so don't even try it. Instead, I encourage you to think about what you can do this week, this month, and then this quarter. So this week, review your 5 core metrics. Not just report them, but really understand what they're trying to tell you. This month, assign ownership. One of the questions I ask every leadership team is, who owns that metric? Okay, not who enters that number on a report, but who owns improving it. Because when everyone owns it, no one owns it, right? Then this quarter, don't try to fix every workflow. Just pick one recurring issue. Maybe it's authorizations. Maybe it's documentation. Maybe it's denial prevention. Eliminate just one root cause. You'll create more improvement that way than chasing 50 individual claims. Okay. Now remember, revenue cycle improvement isn't about doing more. It's about seeing more clearly, because visibility, again, creates accountability, right? And that accountability creates action, and action creates predictable cash flow, which optimizes your cash, right? So if there's one thing I hope today's webinar accomplished for you, it's helping you see that your revenue cycle just a little bit differently, okay? But I also recognize that every ASC is unique, right? Every ASC has different specialties, different payers, different needs, different physicians, different partners, different staffing models, right? Which is exactly why I'd like to offer my time to continue the conversation. So as we wrap up today, I'd like to leave you with one final invitation. If you looked at that last slide and thought, all right, Alisha, that all makes sense, but I'm not even sure where to start. You are not alone. That is what prompted me to do this webinar series. In fact, that's one of the most common themes that I hear across the ASC leaders. Revenue cycle has become incredibly complex, and it can feel overwhelming, especially when you're trying to balance everything at your center. You balance operations, right? You are balancing staffing, physician expectations, compliance, and then financial performance all at the same time. And that's exactly why I'm offering my time and talking to you in a one-on-one strategy session. Okay, we're just going to dig deep into your center specifically so that then you can walk away with a playbook, an action plan. Okay, there's no commitment. I don't need you to sign up with AT&C. I am here as a resource for you. Okay, it's my way of giving back to this industry that has given me so much throughout my career. And so during our 30 minutes together on these strategy sessions, we're not going to try to solve every revenue cycle challenge that your center has. Instead, we're just going to focus on your center. We'll look at where you are today. We'll talk about maybe some of your biggest challenges that you're having. We'll identify where your cash may be getting stuck. And then together, we'll break it down into more manageable pieces. Okay. Sometimes all it takes is just another set of eyes, right? Someone to help connect the dots for you. Someone to ask a few questions that you may not have thought to even ask. And then together, we can begin building a practical playbook, okay, that's specific to your center, not a generic checklist. It's an actual roadmap that helps you gain that visibility that you need so that you can begin to make better decisions and you can begin to be a little bit more confident when you look at your revenue cycle. So if that sounds helpful, what you can do is just scan the QR code that's on your screen to reserve a time that works best for you. All right. So I've intentionally opened up a lot on my calendar because I want to help you as an ASC leader break down your revenue cycle. So you can bring an aging report if you want. You can bring a dashboard, an Excel file. You can bring your biggest frustrations. And honestly, you can just bring questions. You don't have to bring anything at all. So it's an opportunity to have a conversation and hopefully provide some insight that helps move your center forward. All right. So today wasn't about memorizing 5 metrics. It wasn't about benchmarking your organization against everyone else out there. It was really about just learning how to see your revenue cycle differently. Because when leaders have that visibility, they begin to ask better questions, right? They begin to make better decisions and build stronger teams. And then, of course, at the end of the day, we optimize cash flow, right? So next week, we're going to build on this foundation. We are going to move from seeing the problems, the visibility, right, to understanding where cash actually breaks and how you can stop revenue leakage before it impacts your bottom line. So I hope you'll join me. If not, I'd love for you to invite some colleagues as well. The more people we touch, the more meaningful impact we will make. So thank you so much for spending your time with me today. And as I always like to say and end, I see you, you matter, and I am here to fully support you on your journey.